everybody. This is Dr. Jessica Friedman. I am just going to go to our YouTube channel to see that we are broadcasting where we are supposed to be broadcasting. Hold on one second. There might be a little bit of a delay. Hold on, everybody. Okay, if you can all see me and hear me, if you could please let me know, that would be terrific. Yeah, okay. See me and hear me. If you could please let me know, that would. Okay. All right, hold on. We're just checking with the office here. 1 second. Okay, so you have to go to the other. No. Yeah. There are 20 people waiting there. Just 1 minute. Okay. 1 second while we. Okay. All right. So I see that everyone is okay. Terrific. Wonderful. All right. So let's go ahead and get started on tonight's office hours. And you know, many people I'm sure will be joining us as we continue. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to get started here, and I can see your questions. So I'm going to look at those. We actually got a lot of questions over the past week, you know, so I'm going to try to address as many of those questions and answer as many of those questions as I can, while still answering, you know, questions that people post in the chat. So if you have a specific question, please post it in the chat. You know, this is actually a very big week for medical school admissions because AMCAS is opening up, as you all know, for submission in 2 days. So, you know, it is quite a big week. Normally on that opening date, everybody really wants to get their application in, you know, at the opening bell. This year that becomes a little bit less important, actually quite a bit less important because the transmission date for AMCAS to medical schools has been delayed by 2 weeks. So the earliest that medical schools can receive verified applications this year is going to be July 10th. I also attended an AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, webinar this past week, and something that they mentioned, which I think is really important to keep in mind, is that medical schools this year are being incredibly flexible as they can, you know, because of COVID, because of the impact that COVID has had on students' experiences and on the MCAT. So there are 2 major points that I would like to bring up that was discussed at this meeting. The first was that AMCAS is asking that students enter the experiences that they were planning to have and that were postponed due to COVID, to enter those in their AMCAS application as future dates. And they're allowing you to do this year, which is something that has not been possible in past years. But they want to understand what you had planned, and what you're still going to be doing once we open up a bit more around the country. So that's number one. Number two, they really made a point of saying that medical schools, and this is something that we've been sort of really trying to emphasize with our students, medical schools are trying to be as flexible and as accommodating as they can this season because of everything that's going on. And medical schools are going to be waiting to extend interviews, all of their interviews, because they understand that there are going to be some applications coming in that have late MCAT scores. So there's two ways that that's going to kind of manifest itself depending on the medical school. First of all, a medical school may practice medical school admissions truly holistically and may be extending interviews without MCAT scores if you don't have one yet, or they may actually make sure that they save a block of their interviews because they understand that applications are going to be coming in later from students with those MCAT scores. So they're not going to be extending as many interviews initially as maybe they have in the past. So I think that those are two really important points to keep in mind. And again, this kind of goes back to this idea that, you're in less of a rush. There's less pressure to submit as soon as AMCAS opens this year because of all of this. So for example, if you are not taking the MCAT until sometime in July, your scores will not be back until maybe early August. So the reality is that your application won't be complete until then. So you're not as pressured to submit on Thursday when AMCAS opens. So I think that actually, kind of alleviates some pressure. And that's really what medical schools are trying to do here. They're really trying to alleviate the pressure that everybody is feeling this season, because there are so many changes. And if you're just joining us, realize this will be recorded and posted. So you can go back and you can, watch the parts that you missed. But at the beginning of every office hours, I am going to sort of routinely give whatever updates I think are most necessary for students to know. So just sort of keep all of this in mind as you're applying this year. Okay. So let's go ahead and as far as residency applicants, because I know we have some residency applicants in our audience, and it's possible we may start doing separate office hours for those, for the different groups of applicants. But residency, there's no really huge changes right now in terms of residency. Some medical schools are not allowing their students to do away rotations. Other medical schools are not allowing students to come to their institutions for away rotations. This is, of course, impacting, students' experiences in their desired specialties. It's also impacting their ability to get letters of reference for residency admissions. And so this is something that everybody's dealing with. The different residency programs and admissions officers, again, they're trying to be accommodating as well. Everybody's in the same boat. And I think what's important to understand is, based on sort of how COVID is progressing, it's looking like we might sort of get a window before the flu hits us in the winter where things might be safe in terms of, clinical rotations and things of that nature. So just remember that if there is an opportunity to do an away rotation in the fall, that means September, October, November, that's actually still a great time to do an away rotation, even if it doesn't mean that you're going to end up getting a letter of recommendation that's going to go into your residency profile. I realize that for students applying to medical school, this is sort of all Greek to you, because residency admissions is certainly a completely different process than medical school admissions with different nuances and things of that nature. Okay, so let's kind of go to our office hours questions. And there were some questions. I kind of want to try to address things as sort of address things that are, themes that have themes to them, because a lot of people do, tend to have the same questions. So we got a lot of questions this week about letters of recommendation. One of those questions was, do psychology professors count as science letters of recommendation? I mean, they're not hard science, they're soft science. I wouldn't, if you were, let's say, getting 3 letters, for example, from science, and math faculty. It would be fine if one of those letters was from a psychology professor, but if you were only getting 2 letters from science and math faculty, I would feel it would make me a little uncomfortable if one of those 2 letters was from a psychology professor. And again, there are different types of psychology courses. Was it a psychology course that was based on research or something of that nature? Then that might, carry a little bit more weight. We also had a question about writing your own letter of recommendation. And more and more medical school applicants and residency applicants are being asked by people to write their own letters of recommendation. And why is this? It's because everyone's really busy and they just feel like, okay, if I can get the student to write the letter of recommendation and I sign off on it and I read it and I make sure I agree with it, then it's sort of less work for me. So we see this as an opportunity. There's obviously some people think this is incredibly unethical. We feel that if the attending or the person writing a letter of recommendation is signing off on the letter, adding to it, editing it, we don't think that's a terribly unethical thing to do. Whether that letter is from a DO, an MD, a science professor, a principal investigator, a teacher's assistant, it is important to follow the AMCAS guidelines for letters of recommendation. And we have an article on our website about letters of recommendation for medical school. So I encourage everyone, and we will put that in the comments so you can reference that. And there is a link to the AMCAS guidelines within that article, but follow the AMCAS guidelines for letters of recommendation, and that will allow you to hopefully hit on as many of the competencies that medical school admissions committees are looking for. And there has been a lot more talk this year at the AMC meetings about competencies. And so we will also, I think it's in the letter of recommendation article that we have on our website, but we will be sure to also post something on this on the chat where we reference the professional competencies, because certainly medical school admissions committees this year, especially because students aren't going to have as many activities and things, they're really looking for how you sort of demonstrate those competencies, and not always in the most traditional way. So that's really important. Okay, in terms of someone's asking a question. Someone asked us a question with regards to residency. I'm just going to cover a couple of residency questions here. Is it possible to do a residency match for a specialty not offered at your school? This is tricky because especially with away rotations potentially being canceled, it becomes increasingly difficult to match for that specialty if you're not able to do any type of rotation within that specialty. So the idea is that when you're applying for residency, you want to get letters of reference from people within that specialty. So what's crucial is that you get letters of reference from people within that specialty. So, for someone who's applying to a specialty this year that's not offered at their school, I would really, again, encourage you to try to get an away rotation, even if it's in the fall, okay? Some students actually are also being offered the flexibility to postpone their medical school graduation. And again, this is something you'd have to discuss with your medical school, especially if they're in a situation where they've had no exposure to a specialty. Then the question becomes, do you delay your graduation, apply to residency next year? And that's a very sort of a more nuanced decision, and it really depends on how well positioned you are to apply for a certain specialty. Okay, I'm gonna go. Okay, there were also a lot of questions about postbacks and about special master's programs this week. And, just to kind of clarify, a postbac is something that you do when you have no medical school prerequisites. There are some postbac programs that are very structured, where you have a peer group, where you have advising. Those are obviously sort of the easier options, right? Because everything is sort of done for you, and it's in a very supportive environment. But there are certainly people who also design their own postbacs, and that is a very doable thing. We've certainly worked with many students who do that, and that requires you to take all of your medical school prerequisites at a four-year university. You can do that on your own. Some people might be working full-time, or they might not have as much money for a formal post-bac program, and that certainly is very acceptable. Now, the other thing that many students do is something called a master's program, a special master's program in particular. Special master's programs are specifically designed for students who have already taken all the medical school prerequisites, but did not do well enough as undergraduates to be competitive for medical school admissions. So they're going back and they're taking more advanced classes, oftentimes alongside current medical students. And again, those programs are in the same way as post-bac programs. They're designed to kind of be comprehensive and to offer you this support to help you get into medical school. But again, the post-bac is designed for someone who has taken no prerequisites. A special master's program is designed for students who have taken their prerequisites and just are looking to enhance their academics and improve their stats. Okay, let's go to, I'm gonna go to the chat now and try to answer some questions here, and then I'll go back to the questions that people sent me in advance. When writing your personal statement, is it okay to use contractions? It depends on the tone of your personal statement, but yes, this is not a formal essay that you're writing for history class where you're asked never to use contractions, so absolutely that's okay. What's most important is that you have no, spelling or grammatical errors. And what's most important is that you explain your story and you clearly outline why you want to be a doctor and why you're pursuing a career in medicine. Okay, someone's asking a question about CASPER preparation. This has been on my list for a long time, but we're in the midst of our busy season here working with students who are applying to medical school, and I just haven't had the time. CASPER is not a test you really need to spend a ton of time preparing for. On the MedEdits faculty, we have former CASPER raters. We are in touch with medical schools. We understand how medical schools are using CASPER. CASPER is not a make or break situation. It is very, very difficult to do badly on CASPER, okay, just by the nature of how the test is designed and based on how the test is rated, right? And that's sort of what, is the term that they use instead of graded, okay? So with CASPER, what we recommend students do is that you take the practice test and you go through that so you understand what the test is about, what the format is going to be, and you understand how little time you really have to answer those three questions. Ultimately, students only have, even the best typists out there, only have time to write 2 to 3 sentences max for each question. The only people who do badly on CASPER are those who write something somewhat outlandish, meaning that they write something where they show that they're racist or they're sexist or they're homophobic, or they just write something incredibly offensive or that they're really concerned with the legalities of a situation. Okay, so as long as you show that you understand all sides of the situation, you answer the question, with, honestly, ethically, and to the best of your ability, you're going to do just fine on CASPER. Okay, medical schools are not using CASPER as a screening. They use it sort of more to kind of make sure it's aligned with everything else in your profile, right? So for example, let's say all your letters of reference are outstanding and talk about what a humanistic person you are, what a great doctor you're going to be, and then your CASPER has a red flag, right? So when you do one of those things, you write something sexist, racist, et cetera, there's a red flag on your CASPER, so the rater can flag it, okay? So when you have a flag, that concerns people, but as long as you don't have a flag, you're going to be just okay. So yes, I think that 1 week is enough time to prepare for CASPER. Do not stress over CASPER, in other words. If one of my letter writers needs to correct something in my letter, but they already uploaded, can they go in there and edit a letter? No, they can't. They could take, you'd have to call AMCAS about that. They probably could replace the letter, but I wouldn't mess with that unless it's something really significant that they need to correct. Okay, this is a good question and something where we're definitely, fielding a lot of these questions from our students now, and we're getting a lot of phone calls about this from students who are just starting to work on documents. What do you think is a good date to submit the MCAS application? Is June 15th considered good? June 15th this year is great, okay? Again, the earliest med schools are getting any applications, verified applications, is going to be July 10th. So if you submit June 15th, let's say it takes you a max of 6 weeks to be verified, that's a max, you're going to be verified sometime in July. As soon as you submit your AMCAS application, assuming that you're not also studying for an MCAT, which many students this year are in that position where they're studying for an MCAT, you can then start working on your secondary essays. The vast majority of medical schools do not change their secondary essay prompts from year to year, so you can work off old secondary essay prompts. They are all listed on our website, and we will offer a link for that in the chat. And you can work off of a lot of last year's prompts to work on your secondary essays for this year. Now, something else that was mentioned at the AAMC meeting that I made mention of very early on in this meeting is that the osteopathic application, as I think we all know at this point, does have an essay specifically about COVID. Many medical schools are also going to have a secondary essay specifically about COVID. I'm sorry, AACOMAS has an essay in their application about COVID. The allopathic medical schools, a lot of them are going to have a secondary essay about COVID. So you will have plenty of opportunity to write about, how COVID impacted you. Okay, let me go back to the questions that were submitted. I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth here. Okay, so this is another question about letters of recommendation. When is the best time to request letters of recommendation from professors, and how should they be requested? Again, this is all covered on our website. I have a very comprehensive article on the website about letters of recommendation. My suggestion is it depends on when you're applying. So if you're applying to medical school, let's say in 2 years, you probably shouldn't be asking for a letter of recommendation from, let's say somebody who you had 2 years ago. All right. So generally speaking, we recommend that you ask for a letter when your relationship with that person has ended and it's not going to be progressing. So for example, if you're working with a principal investigator and you have ongoing research, you want to kind of wait. You want to wait to ask for that letter of recommendation because they're going to potentially have more to say about you the longer you work with them. Okay. So, but if let's say you're applying to medical school in June and you took a class with a professor in the fall semester and you're no longer going to be working with that professor, then you want to ask for that letter of recommendation, at the beginning of first semester once you're back at school, okay? The latest that you want to request letters of recommendation is now, like relatively speaking. In the ideal world, I'd say the latest you should request a letter of recommendation is mid-April, but for some students, depending again on sort of what their letter profile is looking like and depending on what additional letters they need in their profile, sometimes they need to wait until May to ask for some letters of recommendation. That's a pretty individualized question. Okay, someone asked, why do med schools look at non-science GPA at all and not solely focus on science GPA, since med school is all about science? How important is a good cumulative GPA versus a good science GPA, and are they weighed equally? So, yes, the reason that med schools break up the GPAs into science versus non-science is indeed because they do care more about your science GPA than your non-science GPA. But, in reality, most students, their non-science and their science is usually pretty comparable. So, if I had to choose, I'd rather have your science GPA be higher than your non-science GPA. And I think, just because, yes, they care more about your science GPA than your non-science. Someone asked, how do medical schools really feel about labs for prerequisite classes that have transitioned online during the height of COVID? Do you think applicants will be asked to retake any of these classes or penalized in any way? I do not think so. Again, medical schools are really understanding of everything that's going on with COVID. They are completely accepting and understanding that all classes, including those with labs, have transitioned to online, and they are accepting those. The only thing that we recommend, and this refers to another question that we have here, is that if you are allowed to take your classes for grades, some schools have only given students the pass-fail option to take classes. But if your school is offering you the option for pass-fail, or you can take classes for a grade, then you take it for the grade. Okay. So you definitely want to take all of your classes, especially your prerequisites for grade. Someone asked, I have heard before that if one gets at least a B or B minus in a class, even a prerequisite, not to not to convert to pass fail, but I'm leaning toward picking that option for one class because it's going to bring down my other stellar grades from the semester, because they think they're going to get a B minus on something that on a science class. Again, if you do that, the schools are going to they're going to sort of interpret that maybe you didn't do so great in that class. This is something we would need to look at individually to see what your GPA is overall, how much that is really going to bring down your GPA. We would need to look at the full profile to kind of really give specific advice on that one. But generally speaking, it's better to take all of your science and prerequisite classes for a grade no matter what. And ideally, you want to take all of your classes for a grade if you have that option. Due to COVID, my summer research plans may not happen, and I don't have a lot of other research experiences. Currently, I don't have any research opportunities set for the academic year either. I will be a junior in the fall and was hoping to apply without a gap year, but will I know if I've had sufficient research experience for medical school? Medical schools, especially the top schools, they all want to see some kind of research in your background. So as a junior who does not want to take a gap year, meaning that you're anticipating applying at the end of junior year, I would recommend that you try to get some research next year, even if that's some type of data analysis research that you can do virtually, because med schools really do want to see research. And, we are definitely finding that students who apply traditionally, meaning at the end of junior year, they have a tougher time getting into medical school simply because they don't have the life experiences of students who have taken 1 or 2 gap years. And what is sort of interesting and maybe a little bit unfair is that medical schools consider all applicants together in the same cohort. So you will have juniors, who have just finished their junior year interviewing alongside students who, let's say, have taken 2 years off and, done AmeriCorps or, did 2 years of, clinical research and, translational research, something of that nature. And all those students are looked at together. So more and more medical schools are really valuing students that do have some life experience. And so sometimes the students who apply at the end of junior year are at a bit of a disadvantage. That said, it really depends on your particular situation. We certainly work with a lot of juniors who have, been able to get everything done and who have, really excelled in many different areas, academically, research-wise, community service, and they do quite well in the process. But more and more students are definitely applying, at the end of senior year rather than at the end of junior year at this point. Okay, so this is a question about MCAT, and let's go over this one because I know there are a lot of questions about the MCAT exam. Due to medical schools reviewing applications 2 weeks later, then what would be the latest date in June I should apply, where it would make a little to no difference in the rolling admissions process? I have a lower MCAT of 508, so I want to give myself the best chance of getting a secondary app interview. Could it make a difference under these new circumstances if I apply the first day versus applying middle of June versus late June, for example? If you have your MCAT score, especially if it's a lower MCAT score and you're not retaking the MCAT, we would advise you to apply as soon as AMCAS opens. And why is that? Because medical schools with rolling admissions, as I stated at the beginning of this office hours, medical schools are going to be sort of saving interviews for students who have a late MCAT date, okay? And you definitely want to try to be reviewed with the smallest number of applicants if you have a lower MCAT. So for students who have a low-ish MCAT or a lower MCAT and they're not planning on retaking, I would say the same rules still apply that apply every cycle. You want to apply as soon as AMCAS opens or as close to, maybe within 2 weeks of AMCAS opening so that you can be part of the first wave of applications that are actually reviewed. There is no question that when you are being compared with a smaller pool of applicants, that you're more likely to get an interview. And we certainly see this with our students every year who submit early. They just get more interviews, they get more early interviews, they get earlier acceptances, and the entire process is just much less stressful. Okay, let's go to YouTube. Okay, so how should the most meaningful experience section differ from the activity description? We have an article that will outline for you, everything about the AMCAS work and activity. So we're going to link that, in the chat. But when you have a most meaningful, you want to use the description to describe the experience. What was the experience? What was the nature of the experience? What were your roles and responsibilities? Maybe what was the organization, if that's not something that is really self-explanatory. Then you want to use your most meaningful to elaborate on the experience. What was transformational about it? What did you learn from the experience? What skills did you gain? What insights did you gain about whatever that experience was? So you want to try to offer more details about the experience, again, offering as much insight and introspection as you can. It's also really important, something that we see a lot with students whom we work, people are very good about addressing the soft skills that they've gained through experiences, both in their personal statement as well as in their application entries. But, medicine is science. And, so we always sort of push our students to kind of, really focus on what are the, medical aspects of what you learned? What are, what scientific skills did you gain? And, because we've all, obviously practiced medicine, we can really push you to kind of offer that information based on our own knowledge and understanding of what it means to care for patients. If my MCAT is scheduled for August, should I apply on Thursday and then submit my MCAT score? Zora asks. This really depends, honestly, on are you ready to submit? So because you're taking an August MCAT, you have a little flexibility because most schools are probably still not going to review your application until your MCAT is in. So I would say you can submit on Thursday, but only if you're ready, okay? Because again, it is your personal statement and your application entries together with all of your data and your letters of reference that earn you the interview. And this is why composing the most compelling and interesting personal statement and application entries is so vitally important, because those are really the things that inspire admissions officers to invite you for interviews, okay? And this is also why our students, tend to earn interviews from maybe schools that their stats wouldn't really necessarily predict they would get those interviews, because they write such compelling documents. So you only want to submit once you are ready to submit. You don't want to rush your work, because compromising the quality of your written documents really can end up being undermining. So don't rush for the sake of that. If I want to take a gap year, when should I take the MCAT? Great question. The latest that you should take an MCAT if you are taking a gap year would be in May of your application year under normal circumstances. This pandemic, these are not normal circumstances, but under normal circumstances, you want to, the latest you want to take the MCAT would be May, maybe June. The reason that it sometimes is a little bit more comforting to, let's say, take the test earlier is because then you'll be applying knowing what your MCAT score is, right? So when we're working with students who are trying to make a school list and they have a pending MCAT score, we're composing that school list not only based on MedEdits internal data, but based on the metrics that student has and the MCAT that they anticipate they're going to get. And then we always need to go back and revisit the school list once we know what MCAT the student received. So it's always easier to, to sort of formulate a school list and kind of know what goals are realistic if you have an MCAT score. Yes, so someone wrote, your previous video mentioned August 1 MCAT is not late for this cycle, like confirmation. Yes, that's our view, is that August 1 is not late this year. And why is that? Because August 1st, they are still going to be expediting scores. So it's only going to take you 2 weeks to get your scores. And there's another video that we can reference in the chat. But if you take the August 1st MCAT, your MCAT scores and sort of the earliest date that secondary essays are going to hit, the admissions office are going to they're going to come in at the same time. Okay, let's see here. Zora, you're welcome. Okay, yeah, so this is great. So Jacob says the AMC said that they had 29,000 people start an application this year, which was 10,000 more than last year. They said they think it will level out to be the same as last year. Thoughts? So this is a great question. So yes, I got that same data point from the AMC, which I found really curious. So what they said was the AMC had record numbers of people initiating an application, right? So initiating means that they logged onto AMCAS and then they started an application. It doesn't mean that they submitted their application, which was 10,000 more than last year. And I think that data, Jacob, was based on like the first 3 days that AMCAS was open. I think that because everyone is sitting at home and they're obsessing a lot, that yes, I think a lot of people initiated applications. I don't necessarily think that all those people are going to be actually submitting or applying. I know a lot of people are on the fence this year because of the whole MCAT situation. And I certainly don't think that those 29,000 people all got their documents done, in time to submit on Thursday. So I agree with the AMC that I think it will level out. I don't think that there's going to be more people. I think that was sort of a false number. The MCAT, as you know, also had a record number of people trying to register when they opened for registration on May 8th, and that's why it overwhelmed the system. So yes, I do think things will level out. I think it's also possible that there will be fewer people applying this year, but of course that's all speculation. Nobody really knows. But I do think definitely based on what we're hearing from students that more students are getting scared off because of all the MCAT cancellations. And again, to me, I think this is actually a great year to apply to medical school because it's going to be one of the most holistic application years that we've seen. Just because everyone's trying to be so accommodating. Something else that I want to mention, just kind of food for thought, and obviously we'll be discussing more of this, but at this point, medical schools and residencies have said at this point that all interviews next year will be virtual. Okay. The schools, and this again was discussed at the most recent AMC meeting I went to, the schools that have MMIs are probably still going to be having MMIs, and they're going to be doing those in breakout rooms. So that's going to be interesting. But the interview days will still be interview days, right? You'll get virtual tours and you'll have your interviews. And, so they're going to try to make this as realistic as possible and to keep things fair for both distance and close applicants. They're probably going to make interviews virtual for everybody, even if you're close by, just to keep things equitable. Okay, let's see what other questions are here. Okay, so someone asked, I have a question about extracurriculars. I don't have any clinical hours, but my job involves working with children with disabilities, and I was wondering how that would be viewed by admissions committees. Certainly that would be viewed great. Most students, unless they have worked as an EMT or unless they've worked as a scribe, and most people who are working as scribes have done so as part of gap years, most people don't really have real clinical experience or clinical exposure, and medical school admissions committees understand that. By working with different populations, you're understanding, the needs of other populations, and certainly you're gaining experiences about clinical medicine that you wouldn't have otherwise. Most pre-medical students, their clinical experience goes so far as shadowing. So, that really is what most students have who are applying to medical school. Of course, those who take gap years may have more clinical exposure. Okay, here's a question about residency. Now that ARIS app deadline has been pushed back to October 21st, when can we expect to start getting interviews? Okay, now, first of all, that's a request, okay? I do think that most programs are going to abide by this request to not start interviewing applicants until October 21st, or to not start reviewing applications October 21st. But again, that is not a requirement, okay? So I expect, because residencies are creatures, we're all creatures of habit, to be honest with you, there are a lot of residency programs and a lot of medical specialties that don't start reviewing applications routinely until, the end of October, even the beginning of November. So for the more competitive specialties and for the more competitive programs, this really doesn't change anything with regards to their actual practice. Okay, so with regards to residency, the less competitive specialties and programs generally offer earlier interviews and start, extending those interviews earlier, and the more competitive specialties tend to do this later. So I don't actually think that's going to change all that much in terms of, what actually happens from year to year. In what ways do medical schools screen applications based on GPA and MCATs? Like, do they have a method of automatically dropping students based off both? Yes, definitely. There are some medical schools that have cutoffs. And medical schools will not usually disclose what these cutoffs are. Some will. Some will say, that we don't look at students, who have a GPA below 3.0 or, something like that. But most schools will have some type of formula where they will automatically screen you out if you don't reach a certain threshold. That formula may involve a combination of the MCAT and the GPA. There's no way to know. By the same token, there also are some schools that offer automatic interviews, depending on a GPA or an MCAT, so it kind of works both ways. Our general ballpark for what we advise students, which I think is pretty standard, that probably all of you know, is that you want to aim for a 3.5 or higher GPA, and you want to aim for a 5.10 or higher MCAT. Of course, we have certainly worked with students who have lower than that. But usually when those students, the students that we work with, let's say, who have, a 508, 507, even lower on the MCAT, and get into allopathic medical schools in the United States, they have something else exceptional about them that is sort of allowing them to kind of, still get those interviews and impress people on those interviews. I mean, those students are the outliers. We certainly, work with a bunch of them, though. Okay, so I was wondering if there's any benefit to apply early decision, just to see if I can shorten my gap year from 2 to 1. Usually, we do not recommend applying early decision. And why is that? It's because if you don't get into your early decision school, you then are a late applicant for all the other medical schools to which you are applying. So early decision is not something that we generally encourage our students to do. But again, it also depends to some degree, what school are you applying early decision to? Do you have a relationship with that school because of some work you've done with the school, or are you from a state where, you definitely have the experiences and the metrics that are within, competitive range for that school? And are you fairly confident that you'll get in? And is it really your top choice? So it really depends, but sort of across the board, we generally don't recommend applying early decision. Okay, let's see what other questions we have here. Is the 3.5 science GPA cumulative or for science? It's for both, ideally. Now, again, it also depends on your trend, Anna. So some students might end up with a 3.6 GPA, and maybe their first year they only had a 3.3, and they've just done really well. So we want to look at trends. We want to look at where are the low scores that brought down that GPA. And to sort of, really evaluate that. And we also want to look at the MCAT. So, some students, for example, may not do as well their freshman, even their sophomore year in college, because they're adapting to college. And then sort of once they get the hang of it, junior and senior years, their GPA skyrockets. And then they take the MCAT, and the GPA, what we call, matches the GPA from the junior and the senior year. So that's a profile that's really very appealing. What that says is, okay, you had a tough time early in college, and you learned, and you improved your study habits, and you matured, and then the MCAT kind of supports that data. So again, it's looking at all of the data and seeing how everything sort of fits together. Someone has a 3.3 GPA, retaking the MCAT. Should I apply to MD and DO schools? Definitely, if you have a 3.3 GPA, we would recommend that you do apply to DO schools, especially depending on what that MCAT is. Yeah, how about a 3.1 GPA, untraditional, working from the age of 15 to help pay the bills? So So Zora, this is an exceptional situation. When we work with students who have exceptional situations, there will be exceptions made. Again, we want to see, what that GPA trend is. We want to see where the MCAT is. Ultimately, what medical schools want to know is that you will succeed once you are there. There are some schools with this type of profile that, might be more forgiving than others. If our COVID semester GPA is stronger than our other semesters, even if there's a trend, would medical schools count that up to external factor? They'll or treat it like others. Matthew, that's a great question. If you have an upward trend and you're continuing to trend upward, I don't think that they are going to say, oh, just because they went online and that was easier. For a lot of students, it's really interesting what COVID is doing and how it's manifesting for different people. There's some people who are thriving in this situation and they're actually doing really well and they're really good with their time management skills. They're not distracted and they're able to really stay focused, whereas others, this is a really difficult situation. So, certainly there are some people who are really benefiting from this situation. They're getting involved in community service activities. They're contributing in different ways. And they're actually using this as an opportunity to enhance their application. So Matthew, I don't think that if you have a higher GPA this semester, I think that's only going to be looked upon positively, certainly. And congratulations, that's great. I'm part of a service fraternity and had many leadership positions and volunteer for our different partners. Should I separate the leadership versus volunteering parts in the activity section? You could. How you divide up an activity really depends on the quality of that activity. So you don't want to divide it up to sort of try to create more activities to kind of try to fill this space and make it look like you're trying to just sort of create filler. But if you had leadership roles and they were part of different partners and that was, sort of under the umbrella of the service fraternity, but it was really a separate experience, by all means, I think that you could certainly include that as a separate activity. Any tips on how my personal statement could have that extra spark? Any tips on how I can incorporate my personality into my statement? Great question, Eddie. Be yourself. When you're writing your personal statement, when you're writing your activities entries, you want to be yourself. You don't want to write a creative piece, but you definitely want to write in your own voice. And medical school admissions committees fundamentally want to understand what your story is. They want to understand who you are, both as a student, as a scholar, and as a human being. So don't try too hard. Sometimes when students sort of try to be too different, they actually, it actually sort of ends up backfiring. You want to sort of write in your own way, in your own voice. And that, by doing that, your statement will have the spark it needs, right? Because they want to understand who you are as a human being. And the other issue is that, with medical school, and this is going to be interesting with virtual interviews, in contrast to college where students can, put whatever they want in an application and it sort of never gets caught because there are no interviews for college. For medical school, the interviews, really are a test for, well, is this person on paper who they appear to be sitting in front of me? And an admissions committee member, when they're interviewing you, they can sort of tell if sort of something doesn't match up. So if sort of your voice and your statement wasn't yours, if it doesn't sort of represent the person who's actually sitting in front of them. Okay, so I think we are going to wrap it up. This was a great office hours today. I encourage all of you to send us your questions, info@mededits.com, and you can just put in the subject line office hours questions, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. We will be here again next Monday. We switched it to Tuesday this week because of Memorial Day, but we will be back here on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Pacific time. And I encourage all of you to tune in and subscribe to our channel And also, tell your friends about these office hours. If they become popular enough, we will start doing more of them. And we will also maybe divide them up into different categories, so that we can sort of better address different needs. Because certainly, pre-meds versus medical school applicants versus pre-residency versus residency applicants, everyone has a lot of different needs, and the questions are very different, and also the processes are very different. I mean, medical school to residency to fellowship, it's each of them is very, very different. And of course, we understand the continuum of medical education, because not only because we've been on admissions committees, but because we've practiced medicine and we've worked alongside everyone in these different phases of their medical education. So I thank you all so very much for tuning in. I apologize again for the initial technical difficulties that we had. We're working on that. And if anyone is a YouTube/Zoom expert, I'd love to hear from you with regards to how we can fix that. But thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to watch today. And I also appreciate all the gratitude that's coming through on the chat. So take care and have a great week. And to everybody submitting this week, congratulations. It's a huge, huge milestone when you submit that application. So submit with confidence, do your best work possible. Don't rush anything, okay? But to everyone who is actually ready to submit this week, that's awesome. You should feel great, and take a breather before you jump into those secondary essays. Okay, take care and good night.